There is a company most Americans associate with cheap knockoff rifles sold at gun shows. But that is only half the story. The other half involves howitzers that have shelled cities on 3 continents, rocket launchers with ranges that outclass anything NATO fields at a fraction of the price, and guided missiles that have surfaced in conflicts the company officially had nothing to do with. This is the story of a factory that started by copying Soviet artillery designs in the 1950s and ended up building systems that now compete directly with American weapons on the global arms market. It has sold to governments under United Nations embargo, to militaries blacklisted by Washington, and to armies no Western contractor would touch. It asked no questions. It required no paperwork. Its name is Norinco, and in this video, we are going through every heavy weapon it has ever made. From the first towed gun that rolled off a Chinese assembly line using Soviet blueprints and Soviet advisors, to the precision rocket system that is currently undercutting American HIMARS on the export market today. Chapter 1: The Iron Legacy, Soviet Blueprints and the Birth of Chinese Artillery. The story does not begin with ambition. It begins with a phone call from Moscow. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union transferred to China not just small arms blueprints, but entire military-industrial packages covering artillery, armor, and rocket systems. Chinese factories received production equipment, technical manuals, and Soviet advisors who stayed long enough to make sure the lines ran. What came out of those transfers shaped Chinese artillery doctrine for the next 4 decades. The reasoning on the Soviet side was political. A strong Chinese military was a useful counterweight to American power in Asia. The reasoning on the Chinese side was simpler. They needed weapons, and the Soviets were offering. Both sides got something out of the arrangement. The weapons that resulted went somewhere neither side had planned for. The Type 54 was the first result. A direct copy of the Soviet M46 130mm field gun, it entered Chinese service in 1954. The M46 was one of the finest long-range artillery pieces of its era. It could fire a 33-kilogram shell to a range of 27 kilometers. Flat trajectory, high velocity, capable of counter-battery work at distances most opponents could not match. The Chinese version was mechanically identical. It was built at state arsenals, stockpiled in enormous quantities, and exported to virtually every Chinese-aligned military on the planet through the Cold War. North Vietnam received substantial shipments during the American War. Egypt operated Type 54 batteries in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where Israeli tank crews encountered incoming 130mm fire at distances that caught them off guard. Albania, Sudan, Tanzania, and Pakistan all took deliveries. In several of those countries, the guns were still firing well into the 21st century. A weapon designed in Moscow, built in Shenyang, and still turning up in African conflicts 60 years later. The same logic applied to a shorter barrel. The Type 60 followed as a 122mm howitzer copied from the Soviet D-74. Where the Type 54 was built for long-range flat trajectory work, the Type 60 was a more versatile indirect fire weapon suited for infantry support, lighter to move, quicker to emplace. It shipped to North Vietnam during the American War and gave Viet Cong gunners a capable indirect fire option that American advisors had not anticipated in those quantities. The gun had a maximum range of roughly 24 kilometers and could be broken down and moved by crew without specialized transport, which made it useful in terrain where heavier systems could not follow. Then came the heaviest gun of the first generation. The Type 66 was a 152mm howitzer, a copy of the Soviet D-20, and it represented the upper end of what Chinese factories could produce in that era. At 152mm, a shell from this gun weighs roughly 43 kilograms and produces a blast radius that makes nearby cover almost irrelevant. It was exported to Albania, Egypt, Sudan, and Pakistan. It appeared in conflicts across the African continent through the 1970s and 1980s. Some of those guns are still documented in active inventories today. Alongside it came the PL-66, a lightened export variant of the same design, stripped down for armies with limited logistics infrastructure, engineered specifically to be sold to anyone willing to accept a simplified version. It went to dozens of countries that could not afford or could not obtain Western equivalents. The PL-66 was not the best artillery on any battlefield it appeared on. It was simply the artillery that was there, because Norinco had sold it, and because no one had asked any questions. Everything after this point was built on what these 4 guns proved: that China could manufacture Soviet-grade heavy artillery at scale, price it aggressively, and move it anywhere on the planet without conditions attached. Chapter 2. The rocket that armed the world. Type 63 and the first self-propelled guns. While the towed howitzers went to conventional armies, another system was going somewhere else entirely. The Type 63 multiple rocket launcher entered service in 1963, and it became, by any measure, the most widely exported Chinese heavy weapon in history. At its core, it is a simple 107mm 12-tube launcher. It can be towed behind a light vehicle or mounted on a truck bed. Total weight is around 600 kilograms. It requires no specialized crew, no complex maintenance, and almost no logistical tail. A trained team can have it ready to fire in minutes. Those qualities made it irresistible to anyone fighting an irregular war with limited resources and unpredictable supply lines. The list of conflicts where the Type 63 has appeared is longer than almost any other artillery system ever made. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Somalia, Ethiopia, Chad, Lebanon, Syria, Libya, Yemen. In Afghanistan, Mujahideen fighters mounted it on Toyota pickup trucks, creating a mobile fire platform that could appear, launch a full salvo of 12 rockets in seconds, and disappear before a response arrived. That same configuration, truck-mounted and fast-moving, was adopted by ISIS fighters in Syria and Iraq decades later. The weapon predated the tactic by 30 years. Norinco sold it to over 40 countries. Some of those governments lost control of their stocks. The guns kept moving through borders and hands that nobody at the factory ever tracked. It is still in production. It is still for sale. No embargo has stopped it. That same mobile logic, now on tracks. The Type 70 self-propelled howitzer arrived in the early 1970s, built on the tracked chassis that Norinco was already producing for armored personnel carriers. It was a 130mm gun mounted on an armored hull, China's first domestically produced self-propelled howitzer. It was not a copy of any single Soviet design, but a practical integration of existing components. The gun crew sat inside armor rather than in the open. The vehicle could move with tank formations instead of waiting for the fighting to pass, and the whole assembly could be ready to fire within minutes of arriving at a position. By the standards of what came later, it was modest. By the standards of what Chinese factories had built before it was a genuine step. It served the PLA for 2 decades and established the doctrine that artillery could be mobile, armored, and integrated into an armored column. Every Chinese self-propelled gun that came after it owed something to the logic the Type 70 had proven. The Type 65 anti-aircraft gun was running alongside the artillery program during this same period. A 37mm twin-barrel weapon copied from the Soviet 61K, it became the standard low-altitude air defense weapon for the PLA for decades. It was exported to North Vietnam, where American pilots learned quickly that Chinese-supplied anti-aircraft guns were everywhere and effective at low altitude. It went to Albania, Somalia, and Yemen. It is still documented in active inventories in ongoing conflicts. A gun designed in the Soviet Union in the 1940s. copied by China in the 1960s, still shooting at aircraft in the 2020s. Chapter 3: Scaling the Caliber, the Grad Clones, and the Road to Long-Range Fire. By 1981, China was ready to go bigger. The Type 81 multiple rocket launcher was a direct copy of the Soviet BM-21 Grad. 4,122mm tubes on a wheeled chassis, capable of putting a full salvo into a target area in under 20 seconds. The BM-21 had proven itself in conflicts from the Middle East to Africa to Southeast Asia. China copied it, built it cheaply, and sold it immediately. Iran purchased large quantities during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Pakistan took deliveries. Sudan acquired systems that were later documented in use during the Darfur conflict. Iran, characteristically, did not stop at buying. It reverse-engineered the Type 81 without permission, exactly as it had done with the Type 56 assault rifle years earlier, producing its own variant called the Arash. The weapon China built to copy the Soviets was itself copied by the Iranians. Nobody asked anyone for permission at any stage of that process. The pattern of Chinese weapons proliferating through reverse engineering and unlicensed production had become a recurring feature of the global arms trade. A decade of export data informing something heavier. The A-100 arrived in the early 1990s as a 300mm 10-tube rocket system mounted on an 8x8 wheeled chassis. Range was 100 kilometers. Norinco was making a deliberate move into the heavy long-range rocket market, testing whether buyers existed for a system at that caliber and price point. Only around 20 units were ever produced, and Tanzania became the sole confirmed export customer. A limited run by any measure. But it demonstrated the industrial capacity was there. The lessons fed directly into what came next. The PHL-03 entered service in 2003, and it was in a different category entirely. 12 300mm tubes on a tracked chassis, maximum range 130 kilometers, a direct copy of the Soviet BM-30 Smerch. This was no longer a weapon for irregular forces or low-end militaries. This was a system designed to destroy headquarters, logistics nodes, and artillery positions at distances beyond most counter-battery radar coverage. A full salvo from a single PHL-03 battery saturates an area the size of several city blocks, with high explosive warheads in seconds. Pakistan became the primary export customer. Pakistani PHL-03 batteries are deployed along the border with India, pointed at a neighbor with nuclear weapons. China sold the system with no conditions attached beyond the purchase price. The export market for long-range rockets did not stop there. The WS-1 came in the 1990s as a 302mm system with a range of 80 kilometers. Norinco sold it to Turkey, a NATO member, in a transaction that caused significant diplomatic friction inside the alliance. Turkey was supposed to buy Western. It bought Chinese. The WS-2 followed with extended range out to 200 kilometers. Pakistan became the primary customer again. Saudi Arabia entered negotiations. Then came the AR-3, a 370mm system with a range of 220 kilometers capable of carrying cluster munitions or a unitary warhead. It was sold to Pakistan and placed under evaluation in the Middle East. At 220 kilometers of range with precision-guided variants available, the AR-3 competes directly with American HIMARS systems on the export market. While the United States was sanctioning Norinco for selling rifles, Norinco was building rockets that undercut American weapons on price and matched them on performance. Chapter 4: The Howitzer Goes Global, from Soviet caliber to NATO competition. The self-propelled howitzer program ran on a parallel track, and it tells a different story. The story of a company learning to compete on Western terms. The Type 83 self-propelled howitzer arrived in 1983 as the first indigenous Chinese SPH developed without Soviet blueprints as the starting point. It was a 152mm tracked vehicle, modest in ambition, but significant as a milestone. Chinese engineers had designed an integrated armored artillery platform from scratch. It never exported in significant numbers, the caliber did not match Western standards, and the timing preceded the export push that came later. But it mattered internally. It was the proof of concept. 6 years later, the Type 89 filled the gap in the 122mm category. A tracked, self-propelled howitzer replacing the aging Type 70 platform, updated electronics, improved crew systems, and a more modern fire control arrangement. It was exported in limited numbers and served as the transitional system bridging Soviet-era design logic with the more ambitious platforms that followed. It was not a headline weapon. It was the generation that kept the line moving forward while the engineers worked out what the next generation needed to be. The real shift came in 1997, and it came in a caliber. The PLZ-45 was 155mm, NATO standard. It was the first Norinco artillery system explicitly designed not for Chinese doctrine, but for the export market, engineered to fire the same ammunition as Western howitzers, to meet Western-adjacent performance standards, and to compete on the international stage against systems from France, Germany, and South Africa. Kuwait purchased a battery after the Gulf War, drawn by the price point and the performance specifications. Algeria ordered 54 units. Saudi Arabia evaluated the PLZ-45 against European competitors and gave it serious consideration. Range was 39 kilometers with assisted munitions. Rate of fire was 4 to 5 rounds per minute. Those numbers were competitive. The price was lower than anything comparable from a Western manufacturer. And Norinco asked no political questions about what Kuwait or Algeria intended to do with the guns. That combination of price, performance, and absence of conditions was the product. The PLZ-05 arrived in 2005 as the successor to the PLZ-45 in PLA service. 155mm, tracked, range extended to 53 kilometers with rocket-assisted munitions. NATO analysts comparing it to the German PzH 2000 found the performance figures broadly comparable. A Chinese state company was building howitzers that could be placed in the same technical conversation as the best Western systems in the world. The export market noticed. Then the wheeled variant. The PCL-09 entered service in 2009, a 122mm howitzer mounted on a 6x6 truck chassis, deployable in under 90 seconds, designed for rapid reaction forces that needed organic artillery support without the logistics burden of tracked vehicles. In December 2018, photographs released by Rwanda's president showed PCL-09 systems at a military exercise at the Gabiro Combat Training Center. Rwanda, a country with a limited defense budget and a recent history of devastating internal conflict. Norinco had found it a customer. The export designation is CS/SH1, and it is still being actively marketed across the African continent to armies that cannot afford European systems and will not meet the political conditions that American systems require. The PCL-181 came in 2019, 155mm on an 8x8 truck chassis, air transportable by military cargo aircraft. ready to fire in 90 seconds from road march. Digital fire control, semi-automatic loading, and Beidou satellite navigation as standard. It was designed explicitly for high-mobility warfare, a system that can be flown into a theater, driven off the ramp, and firing within 2 minutes of landing. Pakistan, Bangladesh, and several African nations are in active negotiation. The gun that started as a Soviet copy in 1954 had become, 65 years later, a precision-wheeled platform competing for contracts on 5 continents. Chapter 5: Precision Destruction, Guided Missiles and the Kill Chain. The howitzers and rockets deal in area suppression. This chapter deals in precision destruction. The HJ-9 Red Arrow 9 entered service in the late 1990s as China's third-generation anti-tank guided missile. Laser beam riding guidance. Effective range out to 5 kilometers. Tandem warhead capable of penetrating 1,200 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor behind explosive reactive armor, which means it was designed specifically to defeat the protection systems that modern tanks were adding to counter earlier generations of ATGMs. It could be vehicle-mounted on an armored carrier, fired from a tripod by dismounted infantry, or integrated onto attack helicopters. Pakistan acquired the system. Sudan followed. The HJ-9 was not a copy. It was an indigenous Chinese development that reached peer-level performance against comparable Western systems. Faster, smaller, no wire required. The HJ-10 is the Chinese equivalent of the American AGM-114 Hellfire, a semi-active laser or imaging infrared guided missile designed for helicopter and drone launch. The Z-10 attack helicopter carries it as its primary anti-armor weapon. It has not been officially exported, but components consistent with the HJ-10 system have been documented in proxy conflicts in Africa and the Middle East. A weapon China has not sold, appearing in places China officially has no presence. That gap between what is sold and what is documented in the field is a recurring feature of Norinco's story. The HJ-12 Red Arrow 12 is different from both. It is man-portable. Fire and forget. Imaging infrared seeker, top attack capable, meaning it rises and then dives down onto the thinner upper armor of a tank, rather than striking the heavily protected front plate. It was unveiled in 2014, and the comparison to the American Javelin was immediate and intentional. The Javelin costs approximately $175,000 per missile. The HJ-12 is offered at a fraction of that price. By 2020, it had been documented in non-Chinese hands in conflicts on the African continent, 6 years after its introduction, and with no official export record that anyone has been able to confirm. The Type 90S PAAG completed the ground-based air defense picture in the short-range role. A 25mm twin autocannon system on an armored tracked chassis, it was designed to move with armored columns and protect them from low-flying aircraft and helicopter gunships, the threats that the older towed Type 65 guns could not handle in a mobile fight. It bridged the gap between the towed anti-aircraft guns of the 1960s and the missile systems that followed. The HQ-7 entered service in 1996 as a short-range surface-to-air missile system, China's version of the Franco-German Crowtail. Range approximately 12 kilometers. It could engage aircraft, helicopters, and cruise missiles at low to medium altitude, and offered a capability that towed guns could not match against faster, higher targets. Iran purchased the system and reverse-engineered it, as Iran had reverse-engineered essentially every Chinese weapon it could acquire. The Iranian derivative, the Shahab Thaqeb, has been documented in service with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Pakistan operates naval variants on its frigates, Sudan was confirmed operating HQ-7 batteries during the Darfur conflict, providing air defense coverage during a campaign that the International Criminal Court would later characterize as genocide. A weapon sold by China, copied by Iran, and deployed at the edge of one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the early 21st century. Norinco asked no questions at any point in that chain. Chapter 6: The Modern Edge, SR-5, Precision Rockets, and the End of the Second-Tier Market. By the 2000s, Norinco was no longer just selling affordable copies to armies that could not access Western systems. It was competing for contracts that Western manufacturers considered theirs by default. The SR-5 entered service around 2013 as something the earlier rocket systems had never been. A modular guided multiple launch rocket system with genuine precision capability. 2 pods on a wheeled chassis, capable of firing either 20 by 122 mm rockets or 6 by 220 mm rockets from the same launcher without modification. GPS and inertial navigation guidance as standard. Circular error of probability of 25 meters at 40 kilometers range. That figure puts incoming rounds within a tight enough area to destroy point targets, not just suppress an area. Export customers included Algeria, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. 4 countries with different strategic situations, different threat environments, and one thing in common. They wanted a precision rocket system that did not come with American or European political conditions attached. The SR-5 gave them that option at a price no Western competitor could match. At the far end of the range spectrum, the AR-3 closed the final gap. At 370 millimeters and 220 kilometers of effective range, with precision-guided variants using GPS and inertial navigation, it placed Norinco in direct competition with HIMARS on the export market. HIMARS costs roughly $5 million per launcher unit. The AR-3 is offered at a fraction of that price, from a supplier that will not impose end-use restrictions, will not cut off spare parts following a human rights investigation, and will not withdraw technical support, because the customer's government changed or fell out of favor with Washington. For a significant portion of the global market, those are not secondary considerations. They are the entire purchasing decision. The AR-3 was sold to Pakistan and placed under evaluation across the Middle East. It sits at the end of a line that began with a copied Soviet howitzer in a Shenyang factory in 1954. Outro. The arc of this story runs from a phone call in Moscow in the early 1950s to a precision-guided rocket system competing with American technology on 5 continents in 2024. In between, there were Soviet blueprints copied in Chinese factories, 107mm rockets sold to over 40 countries with no questions asked, 155mm howitzers purchased by Gulf states shopping for NATO-compatible systems at non-NATO prices, anti-tank missiles appearing in African conflicts with no official export record, and air defense systems reverse-engineered by Iran and deployed by Iranian-backed militias in Lebanon. Norinco does not publish end-user certificate requirements. It does not cut off customers for political reasons. It does not withdraw technical support because a government changed or an administration in Washington issued a statement. It builds weapons, prices them competitively, and sells them to anyone willing to pay. The company operates outside the web of restrictions and conditions that Western arms exports carry, and that absence of conditions is not a bug in the business model. It is the business model. The company reports over $21 billion in annual arms sales. It ranks among the 15 largest defense contractors on the planet. The weapons go where they go. That has always been the point.